Hey guys, so today you and I are going to talk about pull requests across teams, so let's get into it. So the question in question was, Frederick, would you say that large companies should allow software engineers to create pull requests in other teams' repos for the changes that they need to move fast and get around capacity issues? Yes, yes I do. So this I would say is if I can, it's actually one of the main. It is the main overall mission that I have in my current role to make this a possibility. The reason being because it's a very difficult thing to make this work, but I have made it work at a fairly decent size before. The difficult part lies not in making this feasible. It is in making it a practice that is accepted and feels secure for the organization that you're dealing with. Because usually what happens is that what developers will do is that they will get this, and this is sort of the thing that we talk about when we talk about ownership, when people sort of fall in love with their own projects and their own code. But if you tell a software team that here is your repo, here is your code, there's this large group of people, especially if they work on it a lot, where they get this attachment and association, they are familiar with their code just as they are familiar with their tools, and they almost form this sort of emotional bond to their own software. And so you have people who sort of go over this thing and they get to learn it and so forth and so forth. But you also have the other perspective where you have someone who may not know the code so well, and that means that if they know that it's owned by somebody else, they might be very reluctant to make changes because they don't really know the domain all that well. And so the problem that happens is, and this is what most organizations are facing, that you have this weird situation where you're trying to divide up features. And in many cases, this is the difficult part, because there is no, and I repeat, there is no way for any organization of sufficient scale to slice up a set of services so that you don't create dependencies, because features it's, as I've said before, guys, these systems are just it's a big network, which means that for a given feature, you might be touching multiple nodes in different services, different systems, and so forth in order to do the thing that you want to happen. And that's the problem, because most of the product management models that we have today are related to areas of ownership. And that's not going to be good enough, because when you own an area, unless that area is completely within your own domain and you don't depend on anything in the network apart from your own services, which is practically impossible to do, but it can happen. It really comes down to what is your architecture, how does your system architecture look. Then in a good situation, you can move very quickly without having to depend on a lot of other people. But for some teams, they're basically locked down because they can never do anything, because they have so many upstream systems that they depend on, or downstream systems where like they can't change anything because they're risking everything every time, right? This is the main difficulty for like when it comes to product velocity or product development velocity. So the way that I argue that this can be solved is to create a situation where teams think in terms of feature ownership rather than a specific service. This is enormously difficult because it requires you to basically say, all right, we have a set of services that all tie in order to achieve some goal on some system. And in order for us to be able to ship this thing in a ready fashion, you're going to have to be able to change code in might be in multiple repos and multiple systems and so forth. And to achieve that, you need to both make sure that the people who own these different, because somebody needs to own the code basically, but at the same time you need to make sure that they feel comfortable that other people are changing their code. They means that they basically have to create a project where they can allow someone in a secure manner to make those changes without causing a bunch of regressions and so forth and so forth. And then you have to make sure that the teams who are going to make the change feel comfortable making those changes as well. So it's in my opinion, it's a matter of comfort, to build the comfort. And my argument is that if you want to achieve that, I've used that analogy a few times before, you basically have to build a McDonald's McDonald's type of system where The teams have conventions for how to set up projects, basically how like you have archetypes of how the projects work, you have basic conventions of how to onboard people, you have basic convention of how to do pull requests, and all these sorts of things that you should have internally at the team level. But it has to be at the level where, and this is why onboarding processes are a very important thing, and effective architecture is important, because if the code bases feel familiar, as I said with the McDonald's, it doesn't matter where in the world you go into a McDonald's, because you're going to feel familiar. If the code is written in a similar sort of way, you have the first step towards getting to a state where you can actually create pull requests across systems. Because if you have a really shitty code base with a lot of legacy and a lot of very difficult processes related to deployment or reuse or whatever, if it's vastly different, you're basically never going to get to a point where you're going to have other teams feel comfortable making those changes, because it's simply too high risk and so forth. So it's going to be safer to just ask somebody else to do it. But that's a non-ideal state, because if you can get people to own features or to take responsibility for features, then you can work at maximum velocity at all times. I do believe that it's very good for you to have like primary owners of code, so that you have someone who actually maintains things, because some services may be more or less involved in multiple areas. But fundamentally, what you need to change in an organization is this idea that it is acceptable for software developers to leave their responsibilities at the end of their network, or like at the end of whatever they own. Because what happens when that happens is that you're basically wasting resources. It's a waste of resources in essence, because you have these people who have the capacity, they're all coders, they can make the changes. It's just that they're committed to only take part in like one part of the system, and so now you're scrambling to figure out what can we fill up their time, instead of productively working on the things that are most high value. And other teams that are over capacity can't leverage the rest of the resources, because of it's basically it's a self-inflicted bottleneck that only exists due to one, culture values, and two, efficient onboarding and standardization of the way that you do development within an organization. If you can solve this, and I have tons of thoughts and tips and tricks on doing that, which is why I have my role. Basically, this is my entire job, basically to make this work across an organization of a fairly significant size. And to fix that, you have to act, as I said, on two levels. One part is that you have to act at the technical level, because onboarding and creating a sense of familiarity within the practices and the way that you write software and create projects, that's one part. That's the one part, familiarity. Then you have the social aspect, familiarity and a sense of security within the community that you find yourself, because you have to break people out of this idea that, oh, I only own this repo or I only own that repo, and you want to get them to a point where they realize that, well, here's a bunch of systems, these are the main owners, but just as an open source project, I can, if I just know what the conventions are, and they should basically be the same for each of the projects, create a pull request and fix this feature, because the team has made it very accessible, very feasible for other teams to make those changes if they need to. So what I want you to take away from this is that yes, large organizations should definitely invest in cross-team pull request and standardization of work processes and community-driven development as much as humanly possible, because you will never be able to like accurately gauge how much, in a sense, the way I like to look at it is, if you take if we're all engineers here, right? It's auto scaling versus manual scaling of resources. If you sit and have a bunch of ops people trying to manually figure out where the load is going to be all the time, you're always going to waste resources, because you're simply going about it in a very inefficient way. You're never going to be able to, like, on a split second account for how many resources you need for an on sale or some peak traffic or something like that. That's why we have auto scaling, so that the system can dynamically redistribute traffic and resources based on where the load is. It's the same thing in software development. Some teams are very exerted. They don't have enough people to help out with certain things, and the reason they become a bottleneck is because of these dependencies or similar sorts of things. And if you can create a situation where they can get us on like temporary assistant, not by allocating people, because as I said, that's an afterthought. You usually allocate people when you don't have the capacity, but the load will usually go down if people feel comfortable changing code in other people's repos. That will bring down the number of people that you have to have dedicated to a single service or a single set of services, and it's also going to make sure that each team actually has an efficient onboarding process and takes care of the repository in a whole different level, because you sort of throw out this idea that a team can just go and do whatever the fuck they want and ignore everything related to making sure that they have a clean workspace and a efficient onboarding process. And the first tell that you can use in order to figure out if somebody actually cares about these sorts of things is based on how similar are the system setups and how easy it is for them to onboard new members. Because I can promise you this much: if they can't onboard like a junior developer without having some dedicated person, like weeks of training or something like that, if you can't just spin up their service in an easy fashion, they're most likely, as I said, just committed to that one repo and they've learned how to do it, but they don't really care whether or not anybody else can figure it out. That is the first thing you have to kill off in order to get teams to be able to do this sort of thing. But if you can get to that point and you know how to build a community of developers and apply a few tricks from the open source model, you will get more dedicated software developers who connect with each other and work much better across teams and collaborate a lot better than you can possibly imagine if they just work on one individual thing. They communicate more efficiently. I have seen this firsthand. And the second thing is, you will actually build in a company where a lot of these dependencies, they sort of just magically vanish because people are not just sitting and waiting for other people to have time to do something they could do instead of sitting and waiting. Have a great day.